Hi folks, Florida Man here. We are one of the biggest, and probably the best, of the diplomacy YouTube channels. I'm also currently publishing a lit RPG fantasy novel on Railroad, linked in the description below. Today we're reviewing one of diplomacy's less talked about alliances, the Anglo-Turkish alliance, also sometimes called the Crunch, for the idea that because these are two corner powers, they can crush the entire rest of the map in between them. We'll discuss how this alliance works, what the pros and cons are, how long it typically lasts, and who it typically benefits most in execution. Now, you might not notice this just looking at the diplomacy map, but the Anglo-Turkish alliance is very rarely an early game alliance, because these two powers are the most distant diplomacy powers possible in the game. As I said, you might not realize this just looking at the map. But the only person the two of them can work together against at all in the early game is Russia. And there are some opportunities for that. They can both decide that they want to go after Russia early, such as if England's primary alliance in the early game is going to be the Western Triple, or perhaps the Anglo-German alliance. In either of those cases, an English focus on Russia is not unusual. In that case, Turkey could be secure in the knowledge that an early attack on Russia is a lot more likely to be successful than it otherwise would be, and may choose to work with Austria against Russia. The other possibility early game is that England and Turkey could work together to limit Russian growth, limit Russian expansion in one or both directions, and so they control how large and powerful the Russian state gets. And that is actually a really powerful tool in terms of leverage, controlling how strong a certain diplomacy power is, especially when it comes to Russia, which already looks huge on the map, is kind of frequently a boogeyman power for a lot of people because it has a tendency sometimes to blow up and grow to a really massive size fairly quickly. So if you can control that growth, that gives you a lot of leverage, both militarily and diplomatically. This is nothing to sneeze at. However, the reason why people think about the Anglo-Turkish alliance as a real possibility is not because of their early game collaborations. It's not because they engage in lots of diplomacy to help each other out, although that can happen if you get an England or Turkey that is particularly diplomatically adept and also willing to reach their hand across the map to try and make a difference. No. What typically happens is that in the middle or late game, after one or two of each of their neighbors has been defeated, England and Turkey might subsequently come together, and by virtue of their geographically opposite positions on the map, they may be very well positioned to destroy the remaining powers between them and come to a draw. And given that that's the actual context of this alliance in most games, I will discuss how that works. So, frequently these two powers aren't even talking until the middle or late game. And nevertheless, they are pretty well suited just by virtue of geography. If they've both survived and been strong through the early to mid game, they're pretty well suited to collaborate at that point. England will be very well positioned to attack France or Germany, unless, again, it is fairly weak after the early game. And Turkey will be well positioned to betray Austria or Italy or Russia, whoever of those three is left. So, this alliance can be very effective just because it's the old make the enemy fight a two-front war strategy, and in practice that is almost always successful. That doesn't mean it's going to be balanced, but between two powers that are in the corners, balance is actually frequently a lot easier to achieve, partially through negotiation, and partially through the use of the stalemate lines that exist on the map and are very helpful for these two powers. This alliance can last a very long time because the reality is that diplomacy isn't like chess, with specific moments that you can really define as the middle game and the late game. You don't know that until after the game is over. So, the middle game of a diplomacy game might last 5 years, it might last 10 years. The early game might have a definitive endpoint, but the middle and late game do not. So, this alliance can last from the end of the early game, I would say, until whenever the game ends. Be that 5 years later, 10 years later, 100 years later, Somewhere online there is a diplomacy game that lasted for something like 80 or 100 game years, so this alliance can definitely last to the end. It will probably hasten the end by existing, honestly, and it benefits the two powers that are involved in it the most, naturally. It's a good, stable way to reach the end game. If you're England or Turkey, the reward of having a corner position that can potentially get trapped in a box is that if you can link up with your opposite number that's also trapped in a box, you have access to a very effective alliance that will likely manage to destroy all of the other enemies in execution if you manage to actually get through that early to middle game part where your neighbors are a big threat to you without getting stabbed. So the beneficiaries are obviously England and Turkey. The person most harmed is Russia, and I would say the next most harmed are Germany and Austria, because they are center powers. When the corner powers link up, it is always harmful to them. And the powers that might not be as much destroyed by this are France and Italy, especially Italy, because England is not likely to ever be able to assist Turkey against Italy. In the event that that happens, you know that something has gone terribly wrong, and that England might actually become a solo threat rather than a draw threat with Turkey, because if England is in the Mediterranean, it means that England is in the process of trying to cross the stalemate line. That is how this alliance actually works. It's very effective. Obviously, either England or Turkey could solo with this alliance. It's really a race a lot of the time. But there's no reason why these two powers in particular cannot form a stable two-way draw position. And I can't say that for a lot of other powers. England and Turkey, if they get together in the middle and stay together through the late game, can easily form a two-power draw, or as Gunn would put it, a joint victory. And that is something very worthy of note. This is something that we should see often. The problem with that in actual practice is that both England and Turkey tend to have stronger relationships with powers that are closer to them, but if we take that diplomatic obstacle and put it aside, then these two powers should be working together almost every game if they've survived that early and mid-game period and gotten stronger through it. So as I hope I've conveyed, the possibilities that are available with this alliance are kind of wide-ranging, but I do think it's worth considering, and I think that it will typically be very effective. It's hard-hitting, it has that strong corner positioning advantage that you want in your late game planning, and when it forms, I think it's likely to be very effective. I hope you enjoyed this alliance overview. At this point, I want to thank and credit my Patreon patrons, and I also want to take a moment to shout out something else that I'm doing. As I've covered in my announcement video and earlier in this video, my story, Ruthless, Path of Conquest, is live and available for reading on the website Royal Road. Almost the entirety of Volume 1 of the story is posted on the website, and at some point in the future you will also be able to listen to an audiobook, but I'll make more announcements on that toward the end of this year. Following the link to Royal Road in the video description, reading some of my story, Ruthless Path of Conquest, and giving me 5 stars on Royal Road is almost as valuable to me at this time as literally handing me money. Although I've also launched a Patreon for the story, since there are a dozen or so people kind enough to literally hand me money for it. If the story continues to do well, my goal is to make my living by creating stuff. If it wasn't obvious, this is also a very good thing in terms of its likely effect on my taking on new and interesting creative projects, some of which might be of interest to you. Until next time, Florida Man, out.